Welcome to Truth Report. I'm Alex Truth, and tonight we are covering a rapidly escalating situation that the mainstream press is dancing around with carefully sanitized language. The United States and Israel are waging war on Iran. Not a limited operation. Not targeted strikes. A war. And the civilian toll is mounting by the hour. Over 115,000 civilian housing units damaged according to Iran's own Red Crescent. We're going to break down what's really happening, who's pulling the strings, and why your government is lying to you about its involvement.
I'm Maya Clarity, and Alex, let's start with the numbers because they tell a story the cable networks won't. The Iranian Red Crescent, that's not a government propaganda arm, that's the internationally recognized humanitarian organization, is reporting over 115,000 civilian units damaged in these strikes. Let that sink in. We're talking about homes, apartment buildings, schools, hospitals. This is not precision warfare against military targets. This is the systematic destruction of civilian infrastructure, and if any other country on Earth were doing this, we'd call it what it is, collective punishment.
And here's what should terrify every person watching this. The United Kingdom, a supposed sovereign nation, is now being dragged into this conflict whether its people want it or not. Prime Minister Keir Starmer stood up and told the British public, quote, "This is not our war." Those were his exact words, reported by Middle East Eye. But here's the problem, Maya, Iran is actively weighing whether to strike British military bases. So Starmer can say it's not Britain's war all he wants, but when your bases are on the target list, you're already in the war. The question is whether anyone bothered to ask the British people if they consented to this.
That's the critical point, Alex. Let's unpack what "this is not our war" actually means in diplomatic language. It means Starmer knows the British public has zero appetite for another Middle Eastern conflict. The Iraq War destroyed public trust in interventionism for a generation. But here's the trap Britain is in: they host American military assets, they share intelligence through Five Eyes, and they have bases scattered across the region that serve as forward operating platforms for exactly these kinds of operations. So when Starmer says it's not Britain's war, what he really means is we didn't choose this, but were exposed because of choices made decades ago that no one ever put to a democratic vote.
And this brings us to the South China Morning Post's devastating analysis, which I think is the most important piece of geopolitical writing this week. The argument is simple and damning: the United States attacked Iran without consulting its European NATO allies. Donald Trump assumed this would be a quick surgical operation, over before anyone had to publicly take a position. He was wrong. And in being wrong, he accidentally answered a question that Western governments have been avoiding for years: would NATO fight a war it hadn't chosen together? The answer, Maya, is no. NATO said no.
And that no has consequences that stretch far beyond Iran. For years, Washington has been pushing NATO toward confrontation with China over Taiwan. The entire strategic framework assumes that when the moment comes, the transatlantic alliance will stand unified. But Iran just proved that assumption is hollow. European nations watched the United States launch a unilateral war, and they stepped back. They didn't invoke Article 5. They didn't rally to the cause. They issued carefully worded statements about de-escalation. If you're sitting in Beijing right now, you just learned something invaluable about the actual cohesion of the Western alliance.
Let's be very precise about what this means for Taiwan. The hawks in Washington have spent billions positioning military assets in the Pacific, running war games, signing defense agreements, all predicated on the idea that an attack on Taiwan would trigger a unified Western response. But the Iran war just showed the world that NATO solidarity has a price threshold, and unilateral American action exceeds it. European capitals are not going to sacrifice their economies and their citizens for a conflict they had no say in starting. Beijing is watching, and they are taking notes.
Now let's talk about the cultural dimension of this war because this is where the moral bankruptcy becomes undeniable. Al Jazeera is reporting that Iran's cultural heritage minister has gone on record saying that 56 cultural and heritage sites have been damaged in the strikes. 56. And the minister is calling this a, quote, deliberate war on the country's identity. These aren't collateral damage, Alex. When you hit that many cultural sites, you're not missing your military targets. You're adding targets. You're trying to erase a civilization's memory of itself.
And this is where I need everyone watching to understand what's at stake historically. Iran is home to some of the oldest continuously inhabited cities on Earth. We're talking about sites that predate the Roman Empire, that predate classical Greece. Persepolis, Isfahan, Susa. These are places that belong to all of humanity. When the Taliban destroyed the Buddhas of Bamiyan, the entire world condemned it as barbarism. When ISIS demolished Palmyra, we called it a crime against civilization. But when American and Israeli bombs hit 56 Iranian heritage sites, suddenly the language gets softer. Suddenly it's collateral damage and fog of war.
The cultural heritage minister used the phrase permanent scar, and that's not hyperbole. When a 2,000-year-old structure is reduced to rubble, you cannot rebuild it. You can construct a replica, but the original, the thing that connected the present to the deep past, is gone forever. And the Hague Convention of 1954 explicitly prohibits the targeting of cultural property during armed conflict. This isn't some obscure legal technicality. This is international humanitarian law that exists precisely because the world watched the Nazis loot and destroy Europe's cultural heritage and said, never again. Well, here we are again.
Let's connect the civilian infrastructure destruction to the cultural site targeting because they're part of the same strategy. When you destroy over 115,000 housing units and simultaneously hit dozens of cultural sites, you're not conducting a military operation. You're conducting a campaign of civilizational erasure. You're saying to the Iranian people, your homes are not safe, your history is not safe, nothing you value is safe. This is textbook collective punishment, and it violates the Geneva Conventions. Period. Full stop. There is no legal or moral framework under which this is acceptable.
And where is the International Criminal Court in all of this? Where are the war crimes investigations? We saw the ICC issue arrest warrants for Vladimir Putin over the deportation of Ukrainian children, which was absolutely warranted. But the standard has to be universal. If bombing civilian infrastructure and cultural sites constitutes a war crime in Ukraine, and it does, then it constitutes a war crime in Iran. The selective application of international law is not justice. It's politics wearing a judge's robe.
Now let's turn to Lebanon, because this story is getting buried under the Iran coverage and that is not an accident. Middle East Eye is reporting that an Israeli airstrike killed 4 members of the same family in southern Lebanon. 4 people from one family, wiped out in a single strike. And this is happening while the world's attention is locked on Iran. Israel is using the fog of a larger conflict to intensify operations in Lebanon with minimal international scrutiny. This is a pattern we've seen before. Every major escalation provides cover for additional operations that would otherwise generate outrage.
The Lebanon strikes are particularly disturbing because they shatter the narrative that Israel's military operations are purely defensive responses to October 7th. Southern Lebanon has been under repeated bombardment for months. Families are being killed in their homes. And the justification keeps shifting. First it was about Hezbollah rocket positions, then it was about tunnels, now it's about preemptive defense. At what point do we acknowledge that this is not self-defense? When you're striking family homes in a neighboring country, killing civilians including children, the self-defense argument has collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions.
And here's what the mainstream media consistently fails to report: the cumulative death toll among Lebanese civilians. Every individual strike gets a brief mention, maybe 30 seconds on the evening news, and then it's gone. But when you add them up, family after family, village after village, the pattern is unmistakable. This is a sustained military campaign against a civilian population, and it's being conducted with American-supplied weapons, American diplomatic cover, and American taxpayer dollars. Every voter in the United States is complicit in this whether they know it or not, and the media's job should be to make sure they know it.
Let's go back to the NATO fracture because I think this is the story that will define the next decade of geopolitics. The South China Morning Post piece makes a crucial distinction: Iran and Taiwan are fundamentally different cases. One sits on Europe's periphery and carries energy implications. The other is 12,000 kilometers away and carries semiconductor implications. But the principle is the same. If the United States can't hold its alliance together for a conflict in the Middle East, a region where Europe has direct strategic interests, how on earth does it expect to hold that alliance together for a conflict in the Western Pacific where European interests are far more abstract?
And this is where the American empire narrative starts to crumble in real time. The entire post-World War II order was built on the assumption that America's allies would follow America's lead. That assumption held through Korea, through the Cold War, through the First Gulf War. It cracked with Iraq in 2003 when France and Germany refused to participate. And now with Iran, it hasn't just cracked, it's broken. Starmer's "This is not our war" isn't just a statement about Iran. It's a declaration that the era of automatic European deference to American military adventurism is over. And Washington has no backup plan for that reality.
The implications for global security architecture are staggering. If NATO is effectively a fair-weather alliance, united on paper, fractured in practice, then every security guarantee America has made to every ally around the world is suddenly negotiable. South Korea, Japan, the Philippines, Australia, they're all watching this moment. They're all recalculating. And the recalculation isn't, can we trust America? The recalculation is, can we trust America to consult us before dragging us into a war? Because Trump didn't even pick up the phone before striking Iran. He just did it and assumed everyone would fall in line. That's not leadership. That's imperial presumption.
Let me bring this back to the human cost, because we can talk geopolitics all day, but there are real people underneath these statistics. 115,000 damaged civilian housing units. Do the math. Average Iranian household is about 3 to 4 people. That potentially means 300,000 to 500,000 people whose homes have been damaged or destroyed. These are people who had nothing to do with Iran's nuclear program, nothing to do with its military posture, nothing to do with any of the justifications being offered for these strikes. They're teachers, shopkeepers, doctors, students. And they just lost everything.
And the humanitarian crisis is only beginning. When you destroy that much housing stock in a country already under crippling economic sanctions, you create a cascade of suffering that lasts for decades. Where do those families go? How do they rebuild when the banking system is sanctioned, when construction materials can't be imported, when insurance doesn't cover acts of war? The people who launched these strikes will never have to answer those questions. They'll move on to the next news cycle, the next crisis, the next threat assessment. But the families in Isfahan and Shiraz and Kermanshah will be living with the consequences for generations.
And this is where I want to challenge every journalist, every editor, every producer who is covering this conflict. When you describe these strikes as targeted, or surgical, or precision, you are lying. 115,000 damaged housing units is not precision. 56 destroyed cultural sites is not surgical. 4 family members killed in Lebanon is not targeted. The language we use matters because it shapes public perception, and right now the language being used by mainstream outlets is designed to anesthetize the public to the reality of what is being done in their name. Stop it. Report the truth or get out of the way.
Alex, I want to address that this is not our war framing one more time because it reveals something deeply broken about democratic accountability in the West. Starmer can say those words because technically, Parliament hasn't voted to authorize military action. But British bases are hosting American operations. British intelligence is feeding targeting data. British diplomatic channels are providing cover. So what does not our war even mean when your infrastructure, your intelligence, and your diplomacy are all actively enabling it? It means your government is participating in a war while maintaining plausible deniability to its own citizens. That's not neutrality. That's deception.
And that deception has a name in international law, it's called complicity. If British bases are being used to support strikes that kill civilians and destroy cultural heritage, then Britain bears legal responsibility regardless of whether British pilots are pulling the trigger. The legal standard isn't, did you fire the weapon? The legal standard is, did you knowingly facilitate the commission of a violation? And when Iran's cultural heritage minister is publicly documenting the destruction of 56 sites, the "we didn't know" defense evaporates. You knew. Everyone knew. The Red Crescent numbers are public. The satellite imagery is available. Ignorance is not an option.
Let's also talk about what's not being covered at all, the economic warfare running parallel to the military campaign. Iran was already under some of the most comprehensive sanctions in modern history before a single bomb fell. The Iranian rial has collapsed. Inflation is rampant. Medical supplies are scarce because sanctions make it nearly impossible to process payments for humanitarian goods. So the civilian population was already suffering, and now their homes are being destroyed on top of that. This is a multi-spectrum assault on an entire population, and the humanitarian organizations that are supposed to sound the alarm are being drowned out by the noise of the military coverage.
Maya, I want to connect something that I think most analysts are missing. The simultaneous strikes in Iran and Lebanon aren't separate operations, they're a coordinated regional campaign. Israel is hitting Lebanon while the United States hits Iran, and the timing is not coincidental. By opening multiple fronts simultaneously, they're overwhelming the diplomatic bandwidth of the international community. The UN Security Council can barely address one crisis at a time, and now it's facing 2 interconnected ones. This is strategic overload by design, create enough chaos that no single atrocity gets the sustained attention it deserves.
That strategic overload also serves a domestic political purpose. In the United States, a war president historically gets a polling boost. In Israel, military operations have consistently been used to consolidate political power and sideline domestic opposition. The people making these decisions benefit politically from the chaos they're creating. And the people paying the price, the Iranian family whose apartment was flattened, the Lebanese family killed in an airstrike, the British soldier stationed at a base that might be targeted in retaliation, those people had no say in any of this. The gap between who decides and who suffers has never been wider.
And I want to put a fine point on what the South China Morning Post analysis actually tells us about American power. The piece says Trump assumed the Iran operation would be, quote, a quick win, over before anyone had to take a position. That sentence should terrify every person on this planet. The President of the United States launched a war against a nation of 88 million people based on the assumption that it would be quick. That's not strategy. That's gambling with human lives. And when the gamble failed, when it wasn't quick, when Iran didn't immediately capitulate, the entire Western alliance structure was exposed as a house of cards.
The quick win mentality is the same delusion that produced mission accomplished in Iraq, the same delusion that said Afghanistan would be wrapped up in months, the same delusion that claimed Libya would stabilize after Gaddafi fell. American military planners have been wrong about every single major military engagement for the past 25 years, and yet the same people, the same think tanks, the same defense contractors keep getting to make the same mistakes with zero accountability. The definition of insanity is doing the same thing repeatedly and expecting different results. Welcome to American foreign policy.
So here's what we need from everyone watching tonight. First, demand that your elected representatives take a public position on this conflict. No more hiding behind, "This is not our war." If your country's bases, intelligence, or diplomatic resources are supporting these operations, your representative owes you a straight answer: are we in this war or not? Second, support independent journalism. The stories we covered tonight came from Middle East Eye, Al Jazeera, and the South China Morning Post, outlets that are actually reporting from the ground, actually talking to the people affected, actually challenging the official narrative. The outlets that aren't doing that don't deserve your attention or your money.
Third, educate yourself on international humanitarian law. The Geneva Conventions, the Hague Convention on Cultural Property, the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, these aren't abstract legal documents. They're the rules that are supposed to prevent exactly what's happening right now. When your government violates them or enables their violation, you have the right and the responsibility to hold that government accountable. And fourth, remember the numbers. 115,000 civilian units. 56 cultural sites. 4 family members in Lebanon. These aren't statistics. These are human lives and human heritage being destroyed in real time. Don't let anyone tell you this is normal. Don't let anyone tell you this is necessary. And don't let anyone tell you there's nothing you can do about it.
This is Truth Report. We don't sanitize. We don't equivocate. And we don't look away. I'm Alex Truth.
And I'm Maya Clarity. Stay informed. Stay angry. And hold power accountable. We'll see you next time.